All right, it's 8:01. Let's go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining me this morning, for me at least, and to learn a little bit more about Communicator and React. So this is another one of our virtual training sessions that we've been doing ongoing, where you get to see one of our smiling faces teaching you about our technology and how it might interface with some other technology. So yeah, let's get right into it. I plan to just walk through building an app from scratch and how you would include Communicator into that, how you can kind of think about how you might want to structure your components in React using Hoops Communicator. So I'll kind of try to lay a framework that you can easily bring a Hoops component right into your React application if you have an existing React application. If not, we're going to be building it from scratch, and yeah, it'll give you a good groundwork for getting started and getting dirty with React. So let's get into it. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Create React App to create our application. If you're unfamiliar with React, it's a very easy, popular way to get up and running with a React application. It's the way Facebook would recommend you get started. Unless obviously you have a giant code base existing already with your React app and want to get going in that way. But yeah, we're just going to be starting from the basics there. And in order to do that, you need to have npm installed, which I believe was a prerequisite sent out to everyone. So if you don't have npm installed, you can install it real quick right now from node.js.com or whatever the equivalent is. And yeah, so we'll be using the Node Package Manager, or in this case, npx, to get started with a React app. So if we just type npx, create React app, and then name it, we'll just call it HC React Basic. And so this will actually run this create React app script or package, and download everything, get it all set up, and basically it handles a lot of the configuration for you. So one thing about React is you have a lot of these components interacting together, and one of the pain points is getting all the configuration set up, such as Webpack and Babel and all of that. But using Create React App, it handles a lot of that configuration for you, and you basically get a working React app right out of the box that you can then use. So we'll just go ahead and wait for this to finish. So now we have this directory in here, this HC React Basic directory. We can go ahead, go into there, and then I'll open this up actually in code. There we go. And I'll blow this up. And if you look in here, so what Create React App did was set up this directory structure for you. You can see you have your source code here, a public folder, and then a bunch of node modules that it also installed to help you there. If you're unfamiliar with the Create React App, there's also a nice little README in there that will give you a lot more information on what it's doing and where to go from there. So a lot of these default files that they give you, we're not going to need. So we can go ahead and get rid of, say, like the tests and the web vitals. What am I doing here? So we'll get rid of those. We'll keep the app, that JS file. So this is this index file is where your JavaScript will get started. So I'll walk through kind of the structure of all of this in just a second. Let's do that. So if you're unfamiliar with React, you serve this index page here, and you can see the HTML here. It just provides a single root that's mounted onto the DOM. And then the way React works is it interacts, or it keeps a state of the DOM in what's called the virtual DOM. And then it compares that to what's actually mounted onto the browser DOM, and makes that comparison and only updates what's needed. And so one of the main benefits of React is that it's very fast, since it's not re-rendering that whole DOM every time you make a change to your web page. It's only making that comparison and updating the part of the DOM tree that needs to be updated. So it starts off from this root, and then you build these components from this root that kind of cascade down and make up your app. So the HTML file is technically sort of where this starts, and then it uses this index.js file to kind of as the entry point to your React app. Get rid of this. Let's see. So if you look into this index.js, this is your entry point. You can see it's actually grabbing this element ID root, which is the only element we have in our HTML, and then calling this render method on the React DOM. And so that's interacting with the virtual DOM, doing that comparison and actually updating. And you can see up here, we're actually rendering this component called app. So that's where we're going to really start off here in this component called app. If you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about with the entry point and everything, I recommend going through some of the introduction to React tutorial type stuff. But I guess the bottom line is this is where you're kind of entering your application, and we're making a component called app, and we'll talk about how to make components in a little more detail. Basically, what it's doing is calling this this function here. So let's actually go ahead and see what comes out of the box in this. So if we say npm run start in this root directory, that will actually start a Webpack development server and launch your React app, or the state that it's in so far. I started removing things, and so of course I oh, I haven't saved this yet. That's fine. There we go. Yeah, just so I don't mess anything up too much. Okay. Sorry, I removed a bunch of that Web Vital stuff, and now it's mad at me. Let's see. I just went through this. What do we do here? Redo that with everything we have. Okay, there we go. So out of the box, this is what it looks like. This is just what the create React app sample gives you. So we're going to modify this and try to get it into sort of a hoops component and everything. First thing I'm going to do is just quickly, I mean, you could remove the header if you want. You can do whatever you want. I'll just keep it there just to have another element in this app. But I'll get rid of some of this text. We can change this to let's get coding with hoops or something. And then down here under the header, we're going to actually have a hoops component at some point. And so we made a comment, that's where our hoops component is going to go. But real quick, I am going to edit this. I'm going to get rid of this text align center. You'll see why that is a problem later if we don't get rid of that. Oops. And then we'll just shrink down the logo, shrink down the size of the banner, shrink down the font. Yeah, we'll resize that. So yeah, now we have a little bit of a white space in here to make a hoops component without having to worry too much about the style from there. So if we go back to our app.js file, what's going to happen is React's going to render this app, and in here there's this return statement. And so There's a lot of HTML in here. What this is actually JSX. If you're unfamiliar with that, it's a blend sort of between JavaScript and a template language. So it allows you to kind of write HTML or XML style code, but really you're leveraging JavaScript underneath the hood. So you can write these tags for components. So if I said I had a component called hoops, I could write this tag like that. And so what that really is doing is creating this hoops component. We obviously haven't written a hoops component yet, so it's saying it can't find it there, and I haven't imported it up there. So let's go ahead and create a new file, and I'm going to call this hoops.jsx. And so this is going to be a new React component. So we have this hoops component, and in order to make a React component, you need to make a class that extends this React component class. And so what we need to do first is import React. This is pretty standard for any React application. And then we will create a new class called hoops. And that will extend React component. And then each React component requires this render method in it. And so that's what's actually going to render what's going on to the screen. So render, now that's going to return some sort of JSX element. And it needs to be a single element. So it's usually going to be some sort of containing div or something like that. So we have a very basic struct. We'll just return null here for now, just have no errors. So if your component's not going to render anything, you can pass null in here. I'm just doing that for now, just to start thinking about what we might need. So in this hoops component, we're going to be managing instantiating a web viewer and everything. So in order to instantiate a web viewer, we actually need a web viewer div. So what we're going to need is a div for the web viewer. And then I'm also going to have some additional tools that might be adjacent to the web viewer. So it relies on data from the web viewer for the viewer. So things like this might be like a toolbar or info pane, things like that. So that's what we're going to want here. In this return statement. So what do we do? Well, I have multiple elements here. I'm not going to be able to return like two different web elements in here. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just make a container. So I'm going to call div id hoops container. I need quotes around that though. And then, yeah, so that's really all we need. So it's going to return this single div. And within here, I'm going to want a element for my canvas. So we'll call this canvas. And then, yeah, whatever other tools we might have. Let's hold off on the other tools for now and just focus on the viewer. So if you're unfamiliar with Hoops Communicator, in order to instantiate a web viewer in your browser, you need to define a div like we just did. And then once that's on the DOM, you can actually use the Communicator API to instantiate a viewer given that div ID. And so it basically knows where to render this canvas in your browser. So we have the div ID, but we have no canvas, or we haven't brought in Communicator at all. I mentioned that the div needs to be mounted onto the DOM before we can actually start instantiating anything. Luckily, React provides these lifecycle kind of hooks into lifecycle methods into its lifecycle, and so React will kind of monitor, did this component get mounted to the actual DOM? Yes, it did. Let's go ahead and run some sort of logic. And so to actually use that functionality, we use this component did mount hook. So like I just said, it's going to wait for this to actually render onto the DOM, and then it'll execute whatever's in here. So this will ensure for instantiating a canvas that we have this element on the DOM. If we didn't use this lifecycle method, it would try to render into a div that might not even be mounted. So now that we have that, we can actually let's go back up to the constructor and make a constructor for this class too. So in the constructor, we will call the parent first, and then from there, I'm going to actually make a member variable for the Hoops web viewer, which we haven't instantiated yet, so it's just going to be undefined. And then I actually like to make a viewer manager to manage a lot of like life cycle type methods of the viewer, such as establishing a connection, instantiating new ones, loading models. So this is a total design choice, whatever you'd like to do. We'll just put this for null for now. We'll revisit this, but basically I'm just going to abstract a lot of the loading methods into this viewer manager. We'll only have one class or one method in there today, but the idea is just like have all your viewer lifecycle kind of logistics type viewing methods and functions in its own file and bring it in. That's just how I do it. It's up to you. So yeah, now we have a member variable for the viewer. We'll go ahead and actually make a viewer. So we'll say who's this web viewer. I'm actually going to use this viewer manager, and we're going to create a method in there called create viewer. And it's going to take a div ID, and that's going to be called canvas, just like we named it down here. All right, so let's quickly make a file called viewermanager.js. All right. So we will export default class, viewer manager. It's not going to inherit or anything from anything. So yeah, we'll just make a single function in here for now called create viewer that takes a div ID. And we will use Communicator. So at this point, we haven't done anything with Communicator. We haven't brought in the library or anything, but we're going to make a call to the Communicator class now. So we actually need to bring that in. How do you bring in Communicator into a React app? I'm guessing your familiarity is usually using a package manager such as npm, saying npm, give me Hoops Communicator. That would be awesome, but unfortunately, it's not how we do things. So we're a little bit old school in that you need to include the library with a script tag, preferably in the header of your HTML. What I'm going to do is actually use the CDN to grab that front end library. So I'll send this into the chat for everybody, so you can also have access to it. And all right, so you can grab the source from there, and we're just going to include this in our HTML, our public or index.html file here. And so this can go anywhere in the head. I'll just put it down here. And so that actually brings in the Communicator library. In a more probably a more production type app, you're going to have a bunch of configuration files that are sort of managing how your project's built and everything, and how it resolves modules and everything like that. In those configuration files is how you'd define Communicator in order to use it as an import object. So if I go back over to Viewer Manager and I want to try to make a new viewer, so if I say let viewer equals new, new Communicator web viewer, blah-de-da-de-da. We'll have some options in there. You can see it's not finding Communicator, and that's where I'm getting at, even though we've brought it in. And that's because we're not like really importing it with ES6 syntax or anything like that. But you can make it so Webpack knows how to handle this object. And the way you would do that is using the Webpack config.js file. I'm not going to do that in this file. I'll show you what that looks like, but I'm not going to do that in this project because it requires you to eject the project. And what that does is bring in all those configuration files. It'll just clutter up the working directory we have now. And so I don't want to go down that rabbit hole and make you guys eject all these files and everything, and just so we can make one simple change. But if you want to see what that looks like, let's see, where did I put this? And I will go through this more in detail at the end, but this is our sample Hoops Web Platform React demo that you can get started with. And in here, there's a how to integrate area. And you can see they're including the script here, just like we did. But there's this additional step here that you might want to do for your Webpack configuration. And so under the module.exports of this Webpack.configuration file, you just need to define a Communicator as an external, telling Webpack, don't include this in your like bundling logic and everything. This is an external library coming in. And so you can define Communicator that way, and then that'll allow you to use Communicator sort of in this ES6 import syntax sort of way. And then it will be able to find that. Like I said, I'm not going to do that in this application here, but it is all set up here if you wanted to look through this sample. And if you look in the Webpack .config file, you can see down here, let's see, there it is. We're returning Communicator as this external. So how are we going to resolve it over here? Well, just for the purposes of this demo, and so we can keep the working directory clean, I'm just actually going to reference it right off the window. I mean, you're not going to want to do this in production setting probably, but it is a viable option. Anything that's included in that header over there should be accessible via the window object. So we'll just do that for now. So I have Communicator, web viewer, and then we have this configuration options object we can set up. So the one thing a web viewer needs is a container ID, and we have that container ID because we are passing it into this function. And then we also want some sort of model. In this case, I'm going to use a micro or an SCS model. So if you have the Hoops Communicator package downloaded, you can find any sort of SCS model in this converted models folder here under standard, and we've got several SCS models in here. I'm just going to take this micro engine one. I'll just make a folder in here for now called models and drop it in there. It's not going to let me do it from there, so let's see. Let's do that. So we have a micro engine there, and since we're just pulling this off the local host, this should be easy. So we can get this with endpoint URI, and then we'll define a path to that model. Actually, we'll just import it up top. So we can just say import micro engine from models / micro engine.scs. Obviously, you probably wouldn't do this in a production setting. You'd have a server that's probably serving this model data down. But just since we're doing this locally and we want a model to be able to play with, I'm just going to throw it in here. It's not the highlight of this talk, so it's not too important. So we have the viewer now. We've defined a few initial configuration options, where it's going to render into and what model we're going to load. And then we can go ahead and just call viewer start. And we'll return that viewer. So that'll give us our viewer. We don't really need to do too much else with this file here. Again, the idea here is you would add additional methods to just manage any sort of high-level lifecycle type stuff with your viewer. But for this training, that's really the only method we're gonna get out of it. All right. So we have a viewer. That's really all we probably need in there. In order to actually see this in our application, let's see, we're going to need to include it there. Let's make sure we have everything we need first off. That's all saved. Okay. One thing we need to do is actually define a space for our viewer. So let's actually give our viewer a width and a height. I am just using this. So defining 65 of the view height, 99 view width, and then position is relative there. So I'm now defining that over here. We still have nothing because I haven't actually rendered this hoops component. So over here, we now have this hoops component. Let's bring it into our main app. Hopefully saving that didn't do anything. So here we can say to just include any user-defined component. You can just call it like that, or since we're not really even nesting anything, we can do that. And then we need to import it up top. So we'll import hoops from Cool. So now it's finding that component. Let's jump back over here. No viewer yet. Oh, I actually haven't included my viewer manager. So import viewer manager from viewer manager. Yes. So now I can actually make this. Trying to call a function on it when I don't even have an object. So new viewer manager. We'll just make a new there we go. Hopefully. There we go. Cool. So now we have a web viewer in here. If you go ahead and if you had loaded a model, you can go ahead and interact here. One thing I will say, as I was kind of working through this earlier, this CDN, I think it's only up to SP1 is the latest version of the library on there. And I think technically you might be able to get a version of SP1U1 right now. And so if you did provide a model that came from SP1U1 and you're trying to load it in the SP1 viewer, that model will be too new to render. So if you're getting a blank screen, that could be one reason why. But I would think most people do not have a SCS file that new. Anyway, so yeah, this is basically the simplest implementation that we can have so far. Just getting an out-of-the-box viewer in here. If we look at sort of our developer tools in here, I have this React plugin here. And so this is just our component hierarchy so far. We have an app and then a hoops component. And off of the hoops component, we're going to try to build a few UI elements that might interact with the scene. All good so far. Great. All right, so let's go look at our hoops component again. Very simple component right now. All we're doing is creating a viewer, and it has that viewer. what if we want to actually create some UI elements? After all, React is a UI library, and kind of hook up some functionality with this viewer. How would we do that? So we have these hoops tools that we were talking about earlier. I'll get rid of this since we have it. So let's try to include those. One thing I want to do here, though, is I don't want to just immediately render all these tools that might be available for interaction when the web viewer isn't ready. So what I'm actually going to do is keep track of the state of the viewer in terms of was it instantiated or not. And based off that state, I am going to do some conditional rendering saying, okay, don't render these toolbar info pane elements. Or yes, the viewer is ready. Let's actually render the components that are going to be interfacing with that. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we want to do is keep track of the state of this instantiated viewer. So I'm going to say this.state. The only place you can actually explicitly set state like this is in the constructor. It's a big no-no to try to change state by just directly modifying, say, if I had this.state.hwe, you don't want to try to modify that directly. You're going to use the set state method. And the reason that's the case is that set state method, a lot of things go on in the background when you do change state like that. And so there's a lot of managing of that data and updating that data, and using that set state method, it ensures that all works correctly. But anyway, for now, we can set the state right here in the constructor, and we'll just say HWV instantiated false. So now React has is keeping track of this state, whether it's instantiated or not. And so down here, we actually instantiated our viewer, and then we can actually update the state using set state like I alluded to earlier. And then we'll just say HWV instantiated. I don't know if I spelled that right, but true. So now we have this viewer, it's instantiated. Once this state changes, the render method's going to call again and say, we've had a change of state. We need to re-render this component to show like what let's reflect the change of this state. And so then we can add some conditional rendering down in the render method down here. So we have our hoops container, and then we're also going to want to include our viewer dependent tools. We don't have a variable containing that. So what we're going to aim to do is store basically our template or our JSX in this viewer dependent tools, dependent on the state of the viewer. Whether we render nothing or whether we render something will depend on that state. So let viewer dependent tools, and we'll actually just keep that blank. So that way, if this conditional does not pass, it just won't render anything there. So if this.state.hw instantiated, so if the viewer is instantiated, let's go ahead and write the JSX for this. So viewer dependent tools equals, we're going to have a div for, actually this will just be a container div, because I'm going to have multiple elements in here. So we'll say UI, or no, we'll just call this viewer dependent tools. And then in here, like I said, we'll make a toolbar and we'll make an info pane. So we'll make two more components in here. So let's do toolbar. Yeah, we're going to need to make these components. I'll just keep it empty for now. So yeah, we need to make a toolbar component. So let's make a new file. We'll call it UI toolbar.jsx. Cool. And we'll do the same thing. We'll take this React method up here, bring it over. And that way we can actually make a class from a React component. Let's see, what else do I need in here? So what is our toolbar going to do? In this case, we're just going to keep it pretty simple. Let's say we're just trying to hook up some buttons that have some Hoops Communicator functionality associated with them. So let's just make a couple of buttons that will form this toolbar. In order to create a button, I'm going to actually abstract that out too. Usually you might be using like a component library or something like that. So a lot of this will already be done for you. This will just be a very simple button class here. And I'm just going to copy and paste from what I already have and walk through, since it's a little low level and you're probably going to use a library for low level components like this. But anyway, just making a button class in React. I'm abstracting it, and I'm calling the ID of this button. I'm going to pass a name to this component, and I'm just appending -button to it. And then I'm actually providing the callback for the button click as props, which I'll talk about in a second. And then I'm just naming the button whatever name I pass to it. Very simple abstraction. So I mean, it's basic. In your application, you'll probably have something a lot more built out, but in this case, we're just going to make a few buttons and assign different behavior with them. So we have that button component. Let's actually set up a few buttons. So as I mentioned before, this is a React component. So we're going to need a render method, and we're going to need to return some sort of JSX. So we need to return one element. I'm going to call this UI toolbar. And then in here, we're going to have a series of buttons. So we'll say button. And then if you're unfamiliar with React, there's an idea called props, which it just means properties. And so this is something you can pass down to a component from another component when you're defining this kind of template structure right here. So I can basically make any tag name I want. I'm just going to call it name or attribute name, if you want to call them that. They're not technically attributes, they're props, but yeah, you can use whatever variable really you want. I'm going to use name here, and we'll just call this a home button. So for manipulating our model, this button will take us back to our original loading position and default view setting for the viewer. So we have a prop called home, and then we're going to also have a button callback prop. And I'm going to write JavaScript. So these curly brackets indicate that I'm going to write JavaScript within this template language right now. And so this is where I'm actually going to use the viewer. However, I don't have a viewer yet with this toolbar here, as you can see. We're back in this Hoops component. Well, I haven't written it out here, but we need to get the viewer to this component somehow. So I'm going to actually use props to get the viewer down to this component as well. So you can see I'm trying to organize this in a way where any UI that's dependent on the viewer is respecting that kind of top-down data flow. And so this main Hoops component has the viewer. We can then use pieces of the viewer and pass them down to our UI elements as needed. I'm actually just going to pass the whole viewer to the toolbar in this case. So if I do UI toolbar, I need to import it up top. But and then I'll call this, let's see, HWV equals this HWV. Cool. So that's the UI toolbar. We can come up top. UI toolbar Cool. So now I have that element over here. I haven't finished writing this, but now I have these props available. So since I've passed this down with this HWV name, and that HWV variable is available during in this object called props, which is a member of the class. So I can do this.props.hwv. So this is how I'm getting my viewer. Actually, let's put this in, guys. And then to reset the view, we'll just say reset camera, and we'll define a transition period of 750 milliseconds. So 0.75 seconds for it to do an animation to go back to its home view. Let's see. What am I doing here? Oh, I need to close this. Boom. And we need to import button. So let's see if I did this right. Let's just walk through what we did real quick. So we instantiated viewer. After we instantiate that, we set the state of this hoops component to true to show the viewer is available. Let's go ahead and render any dependent UI elements on this viewer. And so that's just checking to see if it's instantiated. If it's not, you can see it's just going to pass over this, and viewer dependent tools isn't going to render anything. You're just going to have this canvas. And so that's good for the first basically iteration of it mounting this to the DOM. So the first time through, it's going to say, I don't have anything here. Let's mount this canvas on. Hoops will, let's mount this canvas on. Then the component did mount. We'll recognize that that's mounted. We can instantiate a viewer, and then this set state will fire a re-rendering of this component, which will then give us these viewer dependent tools in the toolbar. And in the toolbar, we're just making a button saying go home. And that button the button part is basically not related to Communicator, so I won't get too into that. So over here, we should see a button now. So obviously this doesn't have any styling or anything like that, so it's not the sexiest thing. But if we interact with our viewer and then come down here and hit home, we'll get an error because I didn't spell this right. Let's try again. Come down here, interact. I hit home, yeah. So then it does that transition, smooth transition back to its original state. So that's just an example of one API easily hooked up to a button. We have a toolbar here, so let's do a couple of buttons. So this is why it was nice to kind of abstract that out into its own button thing. Again, you'll probably use a component library, but that's fine. And then we can just set up different visibility or different functionality here. And so you could abstract these into your own functions and then bind them. You can see here, I'm just using an arrow function to call it. One thing about setting up these callbacks and passing them down through components is you want to be attentive to the context of what this is going to be, what that lexical environment is that it was originally made in, or the variable was originally made in. You can get some conflicts when you're trying to access, say, props on something, and it's using a different context of this, and it'll give you an undefined back. So there's a few ways around that. There's documentation on React's website of how to kind of handle these in different ways. I'm using this method, which is generally safe, but it can lead to performance issues if you have a pretty complicated app, or if depending on kind of how your components are interacting with each other. But for this case, it'll be just fine. So I'm making a hide button now. So let's do this.props.hwv. This will be on the model class this time. We'll say set nodes visibilities, or no, visibility. And what this API does from Communicator is it takes an array of nodes and then will basically toggle the visibility, whether you say true or false. I'm just going to hide the whole model in this case, just as an example button. And to do that, I can just say http://model.get absolute root node. So that will give you that. That needs to be in an array though. So that's just the root node of the model. And so when I toggle the visibility, all of this will inherit down to the nodes of the model tree. And so I really just need to call it on this root node. So that's another function we have here. Now we have a hide button. If I hit hide, your model's gone. And then I won't spend too much time getting into the nitty-gritty details of these other functions here, but just to show that you can hook up some other buttons, here's just evoking the redline operator out of the box. So this will give you kind of like this polyline sort of pen markup operator, and then just a reset button. So you can see in here, I'm basically doing the same thing for each of these buttons. And obviously you don't have to use buttons. You can use whatever UI kind of component you want. But for the case of just showing how to hook up UI elements in React to Communicator, this is plenty enough. So now I have a redline operator. I can go in here and I can draw. I can reset the model. That will bring me back home. If I hide it, reset, home, all those things. So yeah, basic concept of hooking up a UI element there. Let's go back over here and make a different component now. Let's call this one information pane. So let's make a new file. Yeah, let's make a new file called info pane. Information pane.jsx. So this will be another component, and what we're going to use this component for is just rendering some basic stuff to the screen. So this could be like, say, a panel on the side that's querying the web viewer to show what the name of what you're selecting is, what operators are on the stack, all sorts of info, whatever you want. So this is just a quick example of what that might look like. So import React from React. That's all we should need in this one. Export default. Information pane. Type information pane. Extends React component. Information pane. Oh, I need the class keyword, of course. Okay, there we go. So now we just have a basic info pane, and same idea here. So we're going to use React to render some sort of element on the screen. And you could style this element and all of that stuff. And we'll just return, let's just say, a simple div. So you could do like a table. You can set this up however you'd like. But I'll just do a simple div. Actually, I don't even need an ID here. Actually, we'll give it an ID just for good measure. Info pane. And then in here, we could just, I don't know, say whatever we wanted. So let's say we wanted to display the node name and the node ID of a selection we made. So if we go back over into the viewer, if I wanted to select this part, when I make that selection, I want to say, see what that node name is and what the node ID of that node is. Well, we can query that info. Obviously, we don't have any information being sent to this info pane right now. Let's go ahead and include it over here. Information pane. So yeah, we're probably going to want to pass something down into this component since it doesn't have any knowledge of what's going on in the viewer. What do we need? Well, we said we wanted the node ID and the name of the node. We can get the node of the name of the node from the node ID. So really all we need is the node ID. How are we going to get that? So we made a selection in here. We have a callback method in Hoops Communicator that it is fired every time you make a selection event. So we can set up a callback just like we would in any communicator application outside of React. We can do that. And when that selection callback is fired, we can query what the selection was and get the node ID from that. So let's go back up into the viewer up here and set up some callbacks. So we can say this web viewer dot set callbacks. And so we talked about a selection callback. So that callback, if we go over into the Communicator documentation, just so you know how to find any sort of callback like this, go to the API reference and scroll down. Whoa, okay, there we go. Callback map in this interfaces. And then you can see all the available callbacks that are set within Kube's Communicator. So anytime one of these events is kind of triggered within the web viewer, you can have some sort of callback function associated with it. We're looking for selection. So when we make a selection event, we want to be able to get the node ID. You can see there's this selection array callback triggered when a selection event occurs. Perfect. Let's set it up. Selection array. Boom. And then that's going to give you an array of selection events. And then what do we want to do from that? We want to, well, first we want to check to make sure that we actually have a valid selection. So if the select operator is active in Communicator, even if you don't click on a part on the model, since the operator is still making a picking event, it's still considered a selection event. So you want to make sure that you're actually clicking something on the model before you try to execute some of this other logic. So I'm just going to say if selection events dot length is not equal to 0, then we'll go ahead and query what the first selection of that was. So we'll say let first node. So you could have multiple items that were selected kind of depending on how your configuration is for the selection operator. Most of the time you're just going to get one node back, but as you can see, we do get a selection events array back, so you could have multiple objects here. In this case, I'm just going to select and display what is the first node that was selected. So we have this selection events object. We can say we need to reference the first one in that array, and then get selection and get node ID. So get selection and get node ID are also methods in Communicator for querying a selection object. So we have this selection event. We recognize that there's a valid object or a selected object in there. We actually get the selection object, and then we can query the node ID of that object. So now we have our first node here. And we want to pass this down to the info pane, because then we can use the info pane to display that node ID and query what the name of the node is. So I'm actually going to manage this the current selected node in the state of the viewer. So I'll say node ID, and this will be undefined when we first set this up. I guess you can make it null, undefined. And then once we get this first node from the selection, we'll go ahead and set the state, node ID, first node. Cool. And so that performs selection, fires the callback for selection, queries what that selection was, gets the node ID. We now have the node ID, and we can pass that down in the information pane component. So in order to get the name, we're going to want the model class of the viewer. So we'll pass that down. This dot HTML dot model, and we're also going to want that node ID that we just queried. So node ID equals this dot state dot model. So that will pass it down to info pane. All right, so now we should have that data available in the information pane. And we can render it however we want. Like I said, you could put this in a table, you can do whatever. I'm just going to put it on the screen since I'm not going to get wrapped up in the styling or anything, but let's just write some JavaScript here. We'll say node ID, or no, we'll say node name first. Node name is, so we're going to actually query the node name now using this JavaScript. This props model get node name. And then for the node we need, we're just going to pass this props node ID. Cool. So that should give us the node name. We'll break in here. And then we'll put the node ID as well. So node ID. Props node ID. So if I did not mess this up too badly, this should render some information underneath those buttons. Like I said, it's not styled, so it's not going to look anything sexy. So yeah, I've got these. Obviously, I haven't made a selection or anything, so these are just what I defaulted them to. They don't have to be null and undefined. You can set them however you want, really. But that's just how I defaulted them right now. So yeah, we have a viewer, we've got our toolbar, and under that we have like a little information pane. We could style this and move it around wherever we wanted. The point is, when we make a selection, you can see we're now querying what this node ID is with the selection array callback, and then passing that information down into a lower level component so it can then render the information it wants. So you can see as I click through these, the name and the node ID will change, all sorts of stuff there. And then yeah, we still have our toolbar kind of functions there. Yeah, so just to recap, that's an example of kind of rendering some UI components that are dependent on the viewer or how you might want to structure them. Again, if you have these UI components on the screen and you don't have a session that is running your viewer like the whole time, and these UI elements are exposed to the user and they click on it, like it can cause problems. So I kind of like the idea of this conditional rendering thing where you're kind of waiting for the viewer to be ready, or you're waiting for the viewer lifecycle to be all set up, and then you can render these dependent components. Again, it's a design decision. You can do whatever you'd like. That's just kind of how I approach it. Okay, so yeah, this is an example of just getting these components together and how they might interact with the web viewer, how you might pass data simply between them and stuff. Nothing too complicated here, but I wanted to show like how you would get started from scratch. And so I thought it would be a good exercise to just walk through that. I do want to point to our actual GitHub repo with the React demo. This is a lot more fleshed out demo built by my coworker Jin Song. He did a great job with it, and it's available for you to get started and poke around with. It takes a little bit of a different approach than what I just went through, but it's probably good to see multiple implementations of this. This one's a little bit more robust and built out as well. You can see it live on GitHub pages over here if you wanted to. And so, yeah, this is a really nice demo. It's again simple, but demonstrates how you might pass data back and forth with React or just get started. You can see he has tabs in here where he's actually built out the whole model tree. These are all using components as well. If you go back over into the source, and you look in components, you can see he's actually building this model tree up from components, and then he has individual component items that built up this model tree. So it's a nice little implementation of some components there that are coming together to give a nice finished look over here. If you click on any of these individual model tree item components, you can see he's implemented two-way highlighting. So if I click on one over here, it'll highlight in the model. If I click on something over here, it'll highlight in the model tree. So pretty cool two-way selection there. And then, yeah, he implemented some basic operators that you can select, and has sort of a similar info type pane here. So sort of some of the same ideas. It's a bit more built out, robust, and a better starting point for you. Again, he also has all the configuration scripts in here. Whoops. So actually, I'll look at it over here. So yeah, you can see he has all the configuration that's been in here. We went over that Webpack config file, and that will allow you to not have to say window.communicator like I did in the sample. I don't recommend that. I recommend setting it up as he detailed here. It'll just give you a cleaner looking code in the long run. So yeah, I encourage you to check out this repo, download it. There's instructions for how to start it. It's very simple. Basically, you just clone the repo, install the npm packages, and then hit start, and you can get that same kind of working environment as I showed over here. And it's a great place to start as a baseline for your projects, or if you just want to see how we're doing things in React. This is a good spot to start. Did I give a size to my div? Yes, I did. If we pop back over here, I just defined that in the app CSS right here. So it's a good point. You need to define a width and a height. So that's where I was doing it here. You can do it right on the element if you wanted in the JavaScript, but I just put it in the CSS file. Of course, you can do it however you'd like. That's all I see right now. So cool. If there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up. We'll be sure to post this online if you need to reference it. Again, the GitHub page is there if you want a sample project to quickly download and get up and running. That's a little bit more robust here, but yeah, hopefully walking through the exercise. I understand it might be a little bit slow, maybe a little basic, but I think it shows a lot of the fundamentals or gotchas of integrating hoops with React. And yeah, hopefully you found some value in this. But anyways, that's all I have. So thanks very much for your time, and good luck.